All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning and afternoon to everybody who's joining us. Thank you all for joining us today for When Something Stinks, Investigating IEQ and Odor Issues. Presenting today will be one of Forensic Analytical's very own senior project managers, Madeleine Dangazyan. Madeleine has almost 10 years of industrial hygiene experience, and prior to that, she was an environmental analytical chemist for over 20 years in an air quality laboratory. She has extensive knowledge of OSHA, NIOSH, and EPA sampling and analytical methodologies, and vast experience in health and safety and hazardous waste. As a senior member of our team, Madeleine provides comprehensive and proactive industrial hygiene project management, specializing in occupational and environmental exposure assessments, indoor environmental quality services, marijuana grow operations, and wildfire and structure fire assessments. But before I hand it off to Madeleine, I just want to quickly cover a few components of the webinar platform we're using today, GoToWebinar. Everyone is in listen-only mode except for Madeleine and myself, but this does not mean that you cannot communicate with us. As you think of questions that you have for Madeleine throughout the webinar, please enter them in the question box that you'll see in the control panel, which typically is on your right-hand side of your screen. Choose Send Questions to Staff, and we'll cover those during the question and answer session at the end of our presentation for the final 10 to 15 minutes. But with that, I'll hand it off to Madeleine.
Thank you, Taylor. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for all joining us today in our webinar, When Something Stinks, performing investigation of indoor environmental quality, particularly regarding odor issues. So today I want to go over some of the dimensions of odor and an understanding of those. How do we go about conducting an odor investigation? What the roles of an industrial hygienist or an investigator are during an investigation, as well as some analytical methods and sampling techniques that are utilized in order to help identify the sources of the odors. And then some interesting case studies that my company and I was involved with that had to do with doing odor assessments or odor complaints. So we always hear this, right? I smell something. It's a very commonly heard phrase for an indoor environment. Our noses are great tools. I usually like to say we do nasal appraisal often, almost every day of our lives. But we don't want to rely on this method in order to evaluate the odor and to determine, occupant safety. Therefore, I want to see the first question. I want to take like a real quick poll. How many odor dimensions do you think there are? Okay, great. So it looks like we have kind of like a lot of people went over with most people said 12 or 8. Actually, we have odor is comprised of 4 dimensions, and those include detectability, the character of an odor, its hedonic tone, as well as the intensity. And so let's delve a little bit deeper into what each of these dimensions mean. So detectability is based off of what's called an odor threshold. This is the lowest concentration that an odorant will elicit a sensory response in individuals. Now we have to be aware that this is not a number or a fixed physiological number. It's actually based on a statistically derived number. And it represents the best estimate value from a group of individuals that respond to this or from their responses. So it has a little bit of a subjectivity in establishing this threshold. The next dimension was the intensity, so the strength of the odor. And it makes sense that this increases as a function of concentration of an odorant. The perceived strength of the odor sensation increases, as I said, with a function of concentration. And this is the strength that is generally the odor above the set threshold. As an example, the intensity of an odor, like a chef may be able to tell via the intensity of an odor when, let's say, their pot roast was actually done. Next, we have the characteristics. We will always say, what does it smell like to you? And then this also includes the association with odors. So a lot of people might associate a certain type of odor with maybe a distinct memory. This also can change with the intensity. For some, an odor might smell like blooming roses. For others, the same odor might smell like a little wet dog. So a lot of the times we associate these odors with like, oh, it smells like fresh cut grass. However, when the intensity changes, meaning the concentration of this odorant becomes so vast, now it starts to take a different characteristic. So what may smell like beautiful blooming flowers might become really offensive. Think of it as, a nice, beautiful smelling perfume. It smells wonderful, but an overabundance of it might actually become offensive. And then it would be like, oh, this is very, it's actually irritating. And finally, the last dimension is the hedonic tone. So this is a judgment of the relative pleasantness or unpleasantness of an odor. The perception is influenced by the subject's experience, right? The frequency of the occurrence, as well as the character, the intensity, the duration, and the perceptions will vary widely from individual to individual and are really strongly influenced by the external factors such as your emotions, previous experience, and so forth. So having said all of that, with all of these dimensions taking into consideration, that's one of the reasons why doing an odor investigation is so complex and difficult, because there's so many factors that go into the description or the characterization of a specific odor. And of course, the variability. So when doing an evaluation, the investigator really needs to have a good understanding that there's a wide variability of perception of these odors or smells that are being reported, as well as having an understanding or recognition that a lot of chemicals and their properties, as well as human and environmental factors, play a role in this odor variability. Okay, so all of that needs to be taken into account during this assessment or during this investigation. So what are some of the variability factors? Well, we have the human factors, right? Which could be influenced by age, gender, physical, medical state, as well as, smoking or smoker and non-smoker. For example, the smokers are known to show higher odor thresholds than non-smokers, meaning that concentrations of an odorant have to be slightly higher than the actual odor threshold in order for, let's say, smokers to be able to detect it. Gender it's not as significant between the genders, male or female, as far as their detectability of odors. However, it's well known that pregnant women have a far more sensibility, or they have a far more sensitivity to odors, right? And then, of course, studies have observed that there's a decrease in ability to detect odors as age increases. And then as well as physical or mental factors, like individuals with maybe Alzheimer's disease or dementia that's in the late progression might have that decrease in the detectability of odors as well. Next variability comes environmental factors. So if we have workers or staff that are working in certain environmental, environments, their ability to detect is reduced because of the loss of sensitivity, as well as their irritation levels might be affected. So the irritation levels might be affected in two ways. They could be irritated at far higher concentrations, or they could exhibit sensitivity, meaning at far lower concentrations, they might have an immunological response that will create an irritation, as well as other factors, which would be adaptability, meaning you becoming accustomed to it, you're acclimated to the odor, as well as olfactory fatigue, meaning you no longer smell it because the sensors within the nose have actually become fatigued. And then there are chemical properties that really should be considered, right? That also is a huge variability in the types of odors that are emitted from all of these odorous agents. There's hundreds, maybe thousands of chemicals that do have odors, some pleasant, some not so pleasant. So the odor thresholds are dependent on the type of molecule that it is, or the size of molecule that this is, and the type of what are called functional groups that the molecule has. For example, alcohols might smell a certain way than other groups, for example, acetates. If you smell a pear or an apple that's been sitting on your kitchen counter, that has like a nice fruity smell, right? Well, those are called, are classified in compounds that are called acetates. Whereas then you have like really nasty pungent odors that are like sour-like, and those are grouped or classified under compounds that are called carboxylic acid or organic acids. So next I want to see if, here's another quiz question or another question, poll question. So an odor dimension will include all except for which one? Let's see. Wow, that's awesome. It was 86% said it's a source of odor, and that is correct. Odor dimension does not include the source of odor. And lastly, so what do you think the perception of odor is? Is it identical for all? Is it subjective? Is it objective? Is it better in certain times of the day, like mornings or afternoons? And let's see what the results are. Almost there. Perfect. So yes, it is highly subjective, which 90% of poll takers indicated. That is correct. Odor perception is highly subjective, and that is a key because that makes it very difficult in order for us to really perform investigations. So what goes into conducting an investigation? Well, we have to try to see if we can identify the source and then the pathway, as well as what are the exposure levels, and then are there any health effects? Okay, so what are some of the sources of odors? They could be from the actual building materials. For example, new flooring, new carpeting, new paint, new furniture, or it could be materials such as, deodorizers or cleaning products that are being used. Maybe something has changed. A new cleaning product was being introduced into the space. What about the pathway? How are agents getting to the people? Is it through the mechanical HVAC system? Is it through other ports such as operable windows, doors, if the source is for an exterior source, or other ingress or egress exits and entryways? What about the exposure? Are there any levels that are present in the environment as background level? What levels are acceptable? Are we looking at occupational exposure levels? Are we looking at environmental levels? And then as well as the symptoms, are occupants or individuals concerned exhibiting any of these symptoms? What agents are associated or could possibly be associated with the health symptoms that are being reported? So all of that are issues that we need to address during an investigation. So some of the sources could be, in the home, anything that could be brought in, new furniture that gets brought in. There's a tendency to be known as what it's called off-gassing. So anyone has brought in new furniture like IKEA. I brought a desk the other day for my daughter. We put it together and immediately there's like an odor that is emitted. So what's happening is there's off-gassing of materials that went into making the press board or the paint that was on there or any of the finishings that were on there. So over time, it will dissipate and then eventually go away. But that is a source. Same thing for the workplace. What are the potential sources? Were they new cleaning materials that were being introduced? Any new items or new building materials that were installed? And then we have public places as well as air, water, and soil. Is it environmental? Is something going on that's polluting, let's say, a waterway nearby, and that's emitting noxious odors? As well as new products that are being introduced. A lot of people bring in air fresheners. Is it something to that effect? And then you also have people that are also sources too. New perfumes, new deodorants that could cause maybe sensitive individuals to react to the fragrances that are used in order to create those products. And the routes of exposure, most common is inhalation. There's ingestion, not so often when we're talking about odor issues. And then there's dermal. Sometimes the agent or the compound that is the cause for an odor can actually elicit a dermal reaction to sensitive individuals. So an immuno response would be to break out in hives or in rashes, and that's just from inhaling this odorous agent. So how do we go about investigating it, right? So first we have to develop a history. And how do we do that? Well, we need to speak to or interview occupants or find out what the complaints were. What were the descriptions? How did they characterize it? How did they classify that? And any symptoms that were actually reported due to the odor issues or the odor concerns. Following that first initial discussion or as well as any events or incidents that may have occurred preceding the noticeable odor. Following that, we formulate a hypothesis. Well, it could be coming from X, Y, and Z. This is the reason why, based off of what we are hearing from occupants or staff or individuals who are in the space. Following that, do a thorough sensory inspection, meaning a walkthrough inspection of the areas of concern. In addition to that, a walkthrough inspection of adjacent areas that are not reporting concerns, of outdoor areas as well. And then a face-to-face interaction with occupants, because initially the history may be taken via an email correspondence or via a phone call. But now you have interaction with occupants. And finally, we test that hypothesis, whether that be through a sample collection in order to confirm what our theory is, or it may also require a return visit. Following the initial sensory inspection, we may come back for another inspection in order to collect samples. And finally, to accept or reject the hypothesis. Now, rejecting a hypothesis is not a bad thing. It could actually rule out something. So then we go a step further if whatever we had theorized that the cause of the odor was, and now we tested for it and we rule it out, we could come back and do other investigations in order to help identify it. And so what is the role of the investigator or the industrial hygienist? Okay, so in essence, when performing an indoor environmental evaluation, we should really be familiar with, or, as industrial hygienists are expected to know, the chemistry of these compounds, both the physical, analytical, maybe molecular physics. What I mean by that is knowing how these molecules might interact with air, how they may disperse, how they may travel through the air. Will they be sticking on certain porous fabrics such as office chairs or carpeting? As well as trying to do, hazard evaluations based off of our sensory investigations, thinking of what kind of hazards it may pose. And in addition to that, knowing the merits and the limitations of some of these analytical and sampling techniques that are out there. Because as I go on further in my presentation, we'll come to understand that not everything can be tested for and analyzed that is odorous. So knowing all of those limitations will go a long way in establishing or trying to pinpoint a particular source. So what are some of the difficulties? Well, like I said before, there's no one size fits all tests. We can't just walk in and say, we'll take one test and it'll tell us everything under the sun regarding the odor or indoor air quality of an indoor space. Unfortunately, I wish there was a magic pill. There just isn't. It's just based off the sheer number of, like I said, hundreds and thousands of compounds that do have specific or do have odors, and each with different physical properties. Not to compound that more, some of these compounds can go transformations, meaning that they can react in atmospheric environments. Even with simple oxygen, they may react and form something else that's far more odorous than the actual starting compound. So that makes things a little bit more difficult as well. And that goes into, the chemical properties, and which will definitely affect sample collection, because, like I said, there's not one sample that could be able to capture and analyze for all compounds out there that have the potential of odors. So what do we need to do in order to be able to choose an actual appropriate sampling method? Well, we have to really look at what our objectives are. Why are we actually taking a sample? Because during an investigation, sampling is just one small part of the overall assessment. Okay, it's a puzzle piece that goes into all the remaining other puzzle pieces that you're putting together with the visual and olfactory and the sensory investigation that's happening. But the objective of sampling, we need to answer some of the questions. Are we doing it in order to address exposure concerns? Are we only trying to identify a source? Is this in response to an adverse health symptoms or comfort complaints that were reported by occupants? Are we trying to be in compliance with occupational exposure limits, such as the promulgated regulatory limits set forth by Cal OSHA or OSHA, or the non-regulatory recommended limits by NIOSH and ACGIH. NIOSH is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. Then we need to understand, well, what compounds or what chemicals of interest are we really looking to sample for? What are their properties? And are there any applicable methods that will be able to capture these chemicals of interest in order for us to be able to quantify them or to qualify them to see if they are present in the environment or in the indoor air? And that's what's causing this odor complaint. And finally, we need to look at laboratory limitations, right? And that's going to include their analytical limitations, the availability of methods out there that the labs can perform, as well as the costs, because some of these highly specialized tests, not all laboratories will have it streamlined. And so they could get pretty costly and pricey if we're trying to test for everything that may be in the air. And so how do we choose the appropriate method in order to, if we're going to be going that route and taking air samples, right? Well, it starts off with doing our homework, meaning we have to take into account the history of events that we documented, any available safety data sheets that are provided by the site, and then trying to see if are there a specific group or class of chemicals that we're going to be, testing for. However, a lot of times, it's not known because we may be doing an assessment of a standard administrative office space. Well, it's not a factory, it's not an industrial setting, they're not using specific chemicals, their cleaning products are, all approved. So how do we figure out what we're supposed to be testing for? Well, in this instance, we go fishing, right? Based off of the responses that we got from the occupant surveys, based off of the description of the odors. Additionally, what are the odors sporadic? Are they continuous? What is the intensity? Does it happen at certain times of the day? Does it happen, on a weekend or on a Monday right after the weekend? So those are all questions that we answer and to come up with potential sources and then develop maybe a plan in order to collect air samples. Now, some of the sampling, for example, may include the standard typical volatile organic compounds. Now, this diagram here shows on the left, we have like all of the what are called the lighter compounds or the smaller ones, let's just say. As the arrow goes to the right, then we get larger and larger and larger, meaning now we're falling into a different type of category or different class of compounds where different type of methods are going to require in order to capture them in the air. Generally, anything from the left all the way to where these two circles intersect, where I have like solvents and halogenated compounds, we'll be able to use what's called a SUMICAN analysis. And they do like a scan of about 75 compounds or so that could, potentially either eliminate or, include what could be the potential source of the odor. But what if something does not fall in here? What about aldehydes like formaldehyde? We certainly can't do that with a SUMA canister sample. It will not show up if that's the source of the odor. Then we have what are called these, pungent organic acids. We're not going to be able to capture that using this methodology either. What about others, such as the rotten egg kind of odor, which contains the element that are called sulfur or sulfur-containing compounds? Unfortunately, the test method that I mentioned earlier is not going to be able to capture it. So that all comes into play with trying to really characterize what these odors are and the descriptions that are provided by not just one or two occupants, but multiple occupants. Because like I said, it's so subjective. We try to get an underlying condition as far as underlying or common characteristic that's actually reported by multiple individuals that are surveyed. So finally, the question that we have to answer is to sample or not to sample, right? This is really the question. Is that going to provide an additional insight for us to be able to identify what the source is and be able to mitigate it? So I wanted to go over several case studies that I pulled from previous surveys that we've done or assessments that we've done. We've done so many of them, but these were some of the more interesting ones that I wanted to share with you all, and how we went about just to investigate the odor complaints. First one was for a musty odor that was reported in a school administrative office building. So over a period of several days, musty odor was the complaint. There were no known incidents which could have caused that odor, meaning musty odors are usually related with mold growth. So there was no water intrusion events such as, heavy flooding or leaks or anything of the sort. But the school did suspect mold issues because they kept smelling this same type of odor. And they thought that it might maybe be in the roof or in the ceiling. So they had their internal maintenance and facilities personnel inspect their HVAC system. They didn't find anything. The filters were changed just to see if it would help with mitigation. Didn't help, so we were called in and we did a thorough sensory inspection of the subject area as well as the ceiling space, meaning the cavity above the suspended ceiling tiles. Checked outdoor areas just to see if there was any outdoor sources and not necessarily the source was inside the building, as well as the air handling unit or the HVAC system that served that office space. And so the source of the odor, which was very interesting, was a dead fish in the HVAC vent. And did I fail to say that this was a high school? So this was a high school senior prank where a fish was put into an HVAC system or an HVAC vent, and that's what they were. That's what the source of the odor was. So what was the takeaway from this? It was really to do a very thorough recheck of the area. And it's important to check the HVAC system because it's really commonly the source of odor complaints. And then speaking with occupants, there really was no events that would have pointed us to hidden mold or anything like that, just due to the reported musty odor. But in a sense, it was a prank. Next is fishy odor. Another fish story in a residential property. This actually happens with one of my colleagues, where she noticed a fishy odor in the master bedroom. It was there for several days, but only more prominent in the evenings. No recent cooking of fish. The home is not that old. It was built in the 60s. There is a young child and a dog in the household. However, so they checked for any accidents that may have occurred, but nothing was found. All of the appliances were inspected, stove, furnace, really no issues. And so actually the source of the odor was a space heater that was causing the electrical outlet to overheat. Now, so electrical components and the insulation that coats them, they do have chemicals in this plastic insulation. So when they do get overheated, it does give you a fishy odor. Okay, and they were running a space heater in the master bedroom because this was in the winter, so it was kind of chilly. And so doing some Google searches, she found out that fishy odor most commonly caused by an electrical overheating component in a home where no fish has been cooked, recently. And so another takeaway is, there are obvious answers that you may not be aware of. So my colleague, she asked around and she Googled. Google was like a really good help. And this was one of the prominent reasons why you might smell fish in a residential house was stated. And sure enough, she did find an outlet that was overheating. The next one is again, it was an admin office space located on the first floor of a 2-story building. There were historical events of like mild water intrusions, meaning small leaks from the second floor and so forth. But occupants started reporting complaints of malodors, and again, they were described as musty, sometimes offensive was another description that was used. However, they would really notice it really early in the morning, especially on a Monday following a weekend, because the HVAC system was shut off over the weekends, and it would kick in maybe an hour or so before office staff came in. And then it would gradually dissipate over the workday. Well, we did a thorough investigation, did a visual assessment, didn't really find any evidence of potential mold growth or hidden mold growth, which included, checking again above ceiling space and cavities and ceiling cavities, checking the second floor office spaces. Nothing was really found. And then spoke with employees who were on site, as well as maintenance and facility staff. Now, in talking with the facilities staff, they indicated that not too long ago they had actually seen pooling of water on this carpet tiles in the middle of a cubicle space. There was no leaks from the second floor. There was no other water sources. It was not near a bathroom. It was not near a sink or a kitchenette, but it was like in the middle of the office. So what they did was they removed carpet tiles, and they saw there was water underneath. So they mopped that all up, put sealant on the concrete subfloor, and then reinstalled those carpet tiles, and that went away. Well, that kind of like pointed me to a certain direction. I said, well, can we pop some carpet tiles in the areas of that were more prominent? It was a private office space. And sure enough, we did. And the photos on the top two photos indicate that you see that the adhesive or the mastic that is used to keep those carpet tiles in place was disintegrated. The bottom right photo is a tile that we checked out in an adjacent office space, which there was no complaints of odors. And so in conclusion, we said that, well, there's degradation of this mastic. And so a chemical reaction was occurring with the moisture that was coming up from the concrete subfloor, because that is porous. And it was reacting with this glue, and it was degrading it, meaning what was happening was other odorous compounds were being created, because the mastic itself is a low VOC emitting material. But the byproduct that was being created from this reaction was causing an odorous compound to be emitted. And therefore, my takeaway from that was, the thorough walkthrough and the discussion with key staff and maintenance personnel was imperative in trying to find out what the source could have been for this particular assessment. A good investigation technique will really go a long way in identifying potential odors. And doing a sample collection, like an air sample collection in here, would have actually generated more questions than answers, because the odorous agents that were being created by this byproduct from this reaction would not have shown up in your standard VOC testing or SUMACAN testing that's available out there. My next case study it was an elementary school main office. The background on this one is the main office went through a renovation. So they had new flooring installed, there was a remodeling done, new furniture was brought in, as well as a decorative wall was put in, which is that wall that you see on the right side of this photo. But shortly after the wall was installed, staff started complaining of water and like itchy eyes, headaches. One staff member actually experienced a rash on their arms. The odor was reported to be persistent throughout the workday. There were, and then there were no other events or incidents that occurred prior to this odor being noticed. So there were really no other events that could have contributed to this complaint. So how do we go about in our inspection? Well, first of all, we wanted to do what's called, we did a document review, meaning they did do a lot of remodeling. And so new materials were introduced to the space. And then shortly after that decorative wall was installed, that's when really started to become noticeable and occupant symptoms arose. So therefore, we wanted to review safety data sheets for this presswood product that was installed. Meaning we wanted to take a look at the components that were in there, the glues that were used, the adhesives, what varnishes and finishes that were applied, as well as any paints. the decorative wall was actually made up of what's called an MDF, or medium density fiberboard. And through an investigation, we know that the adhesive that is used in the production of MDF, it includes a urea formaldehyde adhesive. Now, on itself, that's not an odorous, it's not a hazardous, it's not a compound of concern. However, when that MDF gets manipulated, meaning it gets cut or it gets nailed or it gets installed, or any manipulation of it where it will cut through the product, now you're releasing that little formaldehyde into the air. So that was what actually may have been off-gassing. And that's how we formed a hypothesis in order to really test it. So that's all before we were able to do an inspection on site. Now on site, we went through the whole office building, checked for odors. There definitely was a new building kind of chemical odor that was observed throughout. However, we also looked for other common sources of VOCs that could be identified inside, where you typically find in indoor environments, right, or indoor office environments. So there was hand sanitizers, which would show up in a testing. There were copiers and printers where toner elements will show up in air testing. There was new furniture, so there is a little bit of off-gassing from that as well. And then the inspection also included us talking to staff, getting the survey, getting their feedback, finding out, what it smells like, and what the characteristics of the odors are. Inspection also included, again, checking the ceiling space just to make sure that there's nothing going up in the cavity, as well as the HVAC air handling unit and external sources. So we also check outdoors just to make sure that we don't have anything else from the outside that's contributing to this. And so in order to test a hypothesis, we did take some VOC samples as well as formaldehyde. Okay, samples were taken in the complaint areas in the indoor, as well as one control where it was in an area where remodel was not done and new materials were not introduced, as well as an outdoor control in order to compare the indoor levels with the outdoor levels, because a lot of these compounds that we do test in indoor levels, we see them outside, and they're generally in the same amount of concentrations. So we wanted to compare those as well. The photos that you see on the lower right is the Suma canister sampling for the panel of VOCs. And then the photo on the top is testing for formaldehyde, which is near that wall. And so I'll go with the findings of the testing. We did confirm that the formaldehyde levels did exceed some environmental reference levels. They were significantly less than the occupational exposure limits that are out there that are mandated by OSHA and Cal OSHA, or NIOSH and ACGIH recommended guidelines. However, sample results were also compared to environmental reference levels because not only do we have staff working there, but we also have students. So levels were compared to EPA and OEHA, and EPA is the Environmental Protection Agency, and OEHA is the Occupation Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment. Reason being is we compared it to these conservative levels because they incorporate a large margin of safety when tabulating their limits in order to account for populations that are far more sensitive than your standard workforce. So that will include, children, the elderly, immunocompromised individuals. So results for the formaldehyde did exceeded those levels. The highest concentration was at that decorative wall. The VOC sample results were typical for standard office environment, so no levels of agents that were tested for were found, exceeding any environmental reference levels or occupational exposure limits. So we kind of knew that, the theory was, or the hypothesis was that that wall that was installed was off-gassing. And so the takeaway is we really needed to do our review and research of the material. And we applied our science and our knowledge and our chemistry into what went in as far as that building material in order for us to decide which sampling and analytical method that we needed to use in order to see what the numbers were and to tabulate what our theory was and to be able to identify what the source was. In addition to that, we looked at the symptoms that were reported by occupants, meaning so the watery, itchy eyes went hand in hand with potentially a formaldehyde off-gassing. And that kind of was confirmed by the testing that we did, as well as, worked with the laboratory closely in order to incorporate what the limitations are and be able to identify any limitations that they have and define them before we actually do some sampling. So if we were just to do VOC sampling, we would not have been able to tabulate and confirm that there was formaldehyde in the air. My next example is, it was an interesting one. It was a residential apartment unit. It was a 2-story unit with a subterranean carport. The subject unit was located on the first floor of the building. And then, the tenants said that it kind of smelled like an old house or like a sewage chemical-like smell. And they were experiencing, headaches, allergy-like symptoms, upper respiratory tract irritation. So they had retained environmental specialists to do some air testing. It wasn't facts. Testing was performed for mold, for VOCs, as well as for formaldehyde. But the results were provided the tenant. However, they didn't really know how to interpret the results. And so they contacted us to see if we could do a document review and be able to ascertain as to what could be going on within their unit. Following a document review, we scheduled a walkthrough inspection just to take a look at that unit, as well as the areas outside, as well as the adjacent units, and then the carport, and to speak with the tenants one more time and do another interview and gather any additional information that they may have maybe forgotten to tell us during our initial call. Upon entry to the unit, there was an unidentified odor. I mean, it was there, but we just, I was the one who did the inspection. I couldn't tell what it was. I couldn't really even classify it. All I knew was, yes, there is an odor there. After a while, I couldn't smell it anymore. So I'm like, did it go away, or is it olfactory fatigue? So went outside and did the outdoor inspection and walked back in, and sure enough, the odor was still there. So whatever the source was, it was a constant source. No significant findings were identified in the adjacent unit that didn't have any odors, as well as nothing as far as an outdoor source for the odors. And so upon chatting with the tenants, walking through the unit, they kept and then they kept telling me, oh, you know what? I think it smells more in the living room. We don't necessarily smell it as much in the bathroom or in the kitchen or in the bedroom. And then sometimes it's more prominent near the fireplace. I'm like, okay, so let's take a look at the fireplace. And using a direct read monitor, I wanted to check to see if there was any maybe methane leak. So if there was a natural gas leak, that could potentially be the source. Now, natural gas does not have an odor, but they do add odorant compounds to it in order for us to be able to detect if there's a gas leak. Doing direct reading instrumentation, doing direct read measurements, didn't really come up with anything. Levels were similar outdoors and indoors. However, if you take a look at the photo on the bottom right, or in the middle, there is a little an orifice, a small orifice where the pilot ignition switch rests. And when I kind of did a nasal appraisal and just kind of leaned towards that, I could feel air moving towards me. I mean, I couldn't really smell anything at this time. I might have been like I was in the room, I was in the unit for too long, but I could feel air moving towards my nose. And I'm like, why is there positive air coming in through this orifice? So that's when I did additional, methane testing, didn't see any elevated levels. Then the bottom right photo depicts like we did what's called a smoke tube test in order to confirm that there was a positive flow of air coming in from that little orifice. Well, why would you be getting positive air through that orifice, which didn't kind of make sense? So the results were, based off of some of the document review that we did, although levels were really low for the VOC testing that was done by other vendors, there was some compounds that are identified that are really associated with a gasoline mixture, right? They're usually found in gasoline and generally are atypical for indoor air. They weren't elevated, levels were not, of concern, but we kind of figured like that shouldn't be inside a unit, right? And as I mentioned, the methane analyzer levels inside the unit were standard with outdoor, which is general background levels for methane. So it wasn't an actual methane or a gas leak. So we concluded that something may have been there may have been a possible building design flaw, which was causing a positive pressure. So odors could have been coming from the carport underneath or interstitial spaces in the building and entering the unit by this fireplace orifice. So that could have been the pathway. Now, what the actual odor was or what the actual sources were, we really couldn't identify. And additional testing wasn't really warranted because they had already done all of this, testing previously, which did not find high levels. But were there compounds that could have been causing the smell in the unit? Possibly. And so we kind of needed to do a thinking outside of the box in order to assess this because they're so complex, and one of the other takeaways is ask a lot of questions, don't be shy, because I didn't know anything about the fireplace until I started talking to the tenants there. And then they started saying, oh, you know what, fireplace this and fireplace that. And kind of it helped me point in a direction of potentially identifying the actual source. What the source was and what may have been coming from, it's still a theory that it was the carport or something inside the building, but something was entering that unit via that orifice because it didn't make sense. And this one was a college classroom. It had exhibited, it had experienced a heavy flooding event following rain showers. So the photo in here, the far wall with the red X's and the windows, that's where water really seeped into the classroom. The room is located in the basement level of a multi-story building. So it did impact concrete walls, it impacted drywall, it impacted the VCT, the vinyl composition tile flooring. And so immediately upon discovery, maintenance and operations started cleaning up. So they extracted the water using a shop vac. They removed vinyl base coves just so to help facilitate drying of the wall material. And then soon after, odors came in. So, odors were observed by the occupants and they were described as musty, sour, foul, vomit-like, baby poop, pungent. So they were all over the place. There was a full spectrum of descriptions. And finally, the classroom was actually vacated because they couldn't really identify the source and until it was mitigated, classroom was relocated to other parts of the building. And so, again, testing was done by environmental specialists that were called in. And I believe testing was done for VOCs as well as for mold. And then the client retained us to review those environmental testing reports and see if we can help identify what it was and maybe assist in mitigating it. Following inspections, following document review, we did do a walkthrough because we kind of wanted to see for ourselves and maybe, see what the odors were like. We also wanted to check the HVAC system, make sure that nothing, that was all in compliance and it wasn't the source. And speak with, staff and do occupant surveys and interviews. So upon arrival, there was a significant, there was a distinct pungent odor that was observed. It was more of like, I described it as sour milk, gym sock, or gym locker room, dirty sock kind of odor. And, visual inspection did not indicate any mold growth. There was no elevated levels in the building materials that we assessed. The ceiling space looked fine. Actually, the odors were less perceived in the cavity above the suspended tiles. So that kind of indicated that the source is not via the roof. The HVAC unit was inspected and did not reveal as the potential source. So, and also talking with the occupants, someone brought up like, after the flooding, we kind of saw bubbling and so forth of the VCT tiles. And so that kind of helped us form, a hypothesis as to what could potentially be the source. We theorized that, again, there was a breakdown of the mastic on the flooring tile. So what that does is it does create a group of compounds that are known as, carboxylic or organic acids. These really exhibit the sour or sour milk or spoiled milk vomit kind of pungent, rancid odors. And they're not detected by conventional VOC testing. So the summa canister VOC testing or the molds or traps air samples that were collected in that room would not have revealed these agents present. So in order to test the hypothesis, our recommendations were to remove all of that flooring, scrub away all of that mastic adhesive that was left behind, do moisture testing of the concrete subfloor, and to evaluate the moisture levels in there, and then apply a sealant. And the client confirmed that, following those mitigation efforts, the odor had disappeared. It dissipated and no longer there. So new flooring was installed, and then college started using the classroom once again. And so with that, what was our takeaway was really to work closely with environmental, health specialists in order to help ascertain the source of the odor issue. Applying the specialists' experience as well as their knowledge of, the chemistry behind it and the science will help investigate the odor issues and potentially find the source, as well as environmental testing. It could either identify the source, it could also rule it out, but it could also be inconclusive. And so you got to be cautious about, doing costly testing, because trying to capture all of these odorous compounds can become very expensive, because it's not just one test that could account for all of them. And like I said, there's no one magic pill, unfortunately. And so with that, I thank you, and I could take any questions right now. I appreciate you guys all attending.
Thank you, Madeleine. That was an awesome presentation. And I know we're right at the noon Pacific time mark, but we had quite a few questions come in throughout the presentation. Just as a reminder, we'll cover one question right now while we've got a little bit more time, but we will send out responses to questions that folks sent in after the presentation as well, if you ask them. So don't worry about that. One of our first questions that we'll cover, and I think the only one we've got time for today, what measure was taken in the case of the formaldehyde off-gassing decorative wall?
Good question. Yes. So, well, we knew we needed to off-gas that. So, but however, in order to do that, working with the client, they erected a containment that was essentially under negative pressure. And so it would exhaust anything that was off-gassing from the wall. So the whole wall was contained in poly sheeting. And then it was exhausted outdoors, I believe. I have to confirm on that, in order for them to help or to expedite that off-gassing process, because it will stop eventually, and then to expedite it, but contain it. And then once that was done, they could remove the containment so that it's not now off-gassing indoors into the occupied spaces or where the individuals were working.
All right. Well, again, I'm sorry that we weren't able to get to all of the questions today. However, we will send responses to those that did ask them, so have no fear about that. We will also send out by end of day tomorrow a copy of the slides that Madeleine covered today, in addition to a recording of this presentation and her contact information should you have any additional questions that come up after today. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Madeleine. That was awesome. And hopefully we will see you guys all soon at the next one. Take care.